The Western media was accused of double standards over its reporting of the lone American gunman who shot dead 6 people and injured more than a dozen others in Tucson, Arizona. As newspapers, TV and radio went into detail about the alleged actions of Jared Loughner, the word terrorist was never once used to describe the man who wreaked havoc with an automatic 9mm weapon. During his shooting spree, he assassinated a federal judge, Judge Roll, and 5 others, while seriously wounding a sitting Congresswoman, Gabrielle Giffords, by shooting her in the head. The media on both sides of the Atlantic also described the incident as a massacre, a word few chose to describe the killings of 9 peace activists on board a flotilla of ships bound for Gaza last May, and certainly a word to be avoided when referring to more than 50 Palestinians killed in the siege of Jenin in April 2002. The reporting of the shootings prompted some to accuse the corporate media of double standards and hypocrisies, stating if Jared Lee Loughner happened to be a Muslim as well as an Arab, or an African or an African American, he would have been labelled a terrorist. Instead, the majority chose to use words like deranged, insane, unstable, and troubled to describe Loughner, as though his alleged shooting spree could therefore be understandably explained. Similarly, an American citizen piloted his plane into a federal building in Texas in February last year, and the public and press dealt with the incident as if it were an acceptable collateral damage, according to some media observers. Joseph Stack, they say, was variously described as paranoid, troubled, a disgruntled taxpayer or tax protester, but definitely not a suicide bomber or terrorist.
Salim, if Jared Loughner had been called Javed Patel, he would have been labelled a terrorist, wouldn't he?
Very likely, very likely. But my greater interest is actually in the purpose behind this labelling, which I think has an effect over time. By legal definitions in the UK, he could or could not have been tried under the Terrorism Act 2000, which has a political dimension to it. We don't know if his motives were political, but you know, he shot a congresswoman and a judge, so he could have fallen under the definition of terrorist in the UK. There's no international agreement on what constitutes a terrorist. It depends on where you stand politically. But the drip effect of constantly labelling Muslims as terrorists or characterising nationalist struggles as terrorist struggles has an effect on the public. Now, if I may quote one quick example. The coverage of Israel, which was partly mentioned there, and the Palestinian struggle. A study by the University of Nottingham, very authoritative study, interviewed over 4,000 British people about, and these were people who said they were not that interested in the media, they didn't watch the news, they didn't take any notice of news, they didn't know anything about Israel-Palestine. When they were asked, what is your perception of what's going on, 72% of them said the Israelis are defending their territory against Palestinian aggression. That's the message people who were not interested in the news took home from the news. And when they were asked about the incident of the young 12-year-old Palestinian boy who was shot with his father by soldiers, Israeli soldiers, when they were asked what they remembered of that incident, they repeated pretty much word for word what the news reports at the time had said and the slant that they had taken on it. Now, all I'm saying is, when you constantly label one group of people as terrorists and don't label everybody who've done something similar things as terrorists, then the perception grows in people's minds very slowly, maybe not noticed by them or anybody else. When they see a Muslim, oh, terrorist, oh, that woman's oppressed because she's got a brush. These are the labels, the effect of these labels.
Let me bring Leon in on this, because I saw you nodding there. I mean, who is setting this agenda?
Well, I think those are all really valid and interesting points, and I would agree with those points. I think what we need to realise about the media is 2 really important key things. The first is, as we've already alluded to, the media is a business, and it is not, as some people like to think, especially journalists, a factual-based mirror of the world. It's an entertainment industry. So the reason that we see lots of stories against Muslims is partly to do with the climate that we live in, and the bad Muslim guy fits with the agenda that is out there and the type of discourse that is existing.
And the fear factor that Ben was mentioning?
Well, the fear factor, I think, comes from this need to sell newspapers, to have a greater audience, and as was already said, people like this, people like to be scared. If something scary is going on, you want to read about it. But the second really important thing that I want to really point out is that the media, and we're talking about Western media or British media here, they do act, I believe, as has been argued by media theorists, as a propaganda tool for Western governments. So, for example, if a Muslim terrorist, commits a suicide bombing, he will easily, or she will easily be labelled as a terrorist, and the same violence or similar violence, which might kill just as many people or more people or much more people, would never be called violence if it was from a Western government. So I'm not trying to justify violence from any side. I condemn all of those violences. But what I'm trying to say is that the BBC, for example, will say that, the terrorist has killed innocent civilians, but for them to say the same sort of things about military operations from Western countries is much more unlikely, and that's why I think the media can be categorised as a propaganda arm.
Let me bring in Ben, because you work for the Bow Group. It's a right-wing think tank. It needs to get its message out. How easy is it to get your message out in the media?
Well, I think it varies. I mean, often there is a lot of media interest in what the Bow Group does, but I really would like to come back to the points raised there, and I think the difference between the action of a quote-unquote Muslim terrorist and the actions of, for example, the disgruntled taxpayer who flew his plane into a building, is that if the Muslim terrorist was committing those acts as part of an agenda which is taken part in by a wide number of people. I mean, if it wasn't an individual act, it was part of a wider movement, then I think that's why it's perceived as terrorism. Now, I must say I have to disagree that if the Tucson, Arizona killings were if it had been a Muslim that had taken part in those killings, I must say I don't think there would have automatically been an assumption that it was a terrorist attack.
On that note, we're heading towards a break, and as usual, before we go, there's a question. I want to know who said this.
There can be no higher law in journalism than to tell the truth and to shame the devil. Remain detached from the great.
Stay tuned for the answer right after the news.